A man settling his late mother's estate found a small gold and steel Rolex in her jewelry box, a dainty little thing with a date window, decided it was a dated lady's dress watch nobody would want, and let it go to a dealer with the rest of the jewelry for a few $100s. The dealer didn't blink. Within a year, that same watch was worth more than double what he paid, because it was a specific vintage date-just reference, quietly appreciating faster than almost anything in the Rolex catalog, and the family never knew. That's not a coincidence. The watch didn't become valuable the day it left the house. It was always valuable. The value was lost the moment it passed from someone who didn't know what they held to someone who did, and that gap is where almost all the money in the vintage Rolex world lives. Here's the thing about Rolex. Everyone knows the name. Everyone assumes the Submariner and the Daytona are the valuable ones, and that assumption is exactly the trap, because the watches quietly climbing fastest right now are the plain ones, the small ones, the dress pieces, and the overlooked tool references that don't look like money at all. To you, they look like an old, modest, maybe even feminine watch you'd never connect with a fortune. To a collector, they're a reference number, an era, a dial variant, and a set of details that decide whether you're holding a $2,000 watch or a $30,000 one. The real question isn't whether vintage Rolex is worth money. It's why the valuable ones stay so cheap in the owner's hands, and who benefits from the fact that you can't tell them apart by looking. The answer is the same for both. Knowledge here sits in very few hands, it's rarely volunteered, and a whole resale economy runs on that imbalance. So here are 10 vintage Rolex models, by name and reference, that ordinary people own without guessing they're worth a fortune. One warning first, and it matters more than anything else. Do not polish it. A vintage Rolex, with its original sharp case lines and factory chamfers, is worth far more than one buffed smooth at a jeweler, and over-polishing is one of the fastest ways to destroy value, right alongside swapping the dial or refinishing it. The first is the vintage 34mm Oyster Perpetual and Date, references like the 1002 and the 1500. These are the entry-level vintage Rolexes, plain three-handers in a modest 34mm case, the kind of watch people dismiss as boring or too small. That's the trap. At 34mm, they sit perfectly in the current collector trend towards smaller, refined case sizes, and they're among the most affordable ways to own a genuine vintage Rolex, which is exactly why they're climbing. The value lives in the dial, because these came in a full spectrum of colors and textures, and the 1500 date in particular saw its average value jump over 40% recently, with a yellow gold shell version distinguished by a stepped, triple-sunk date that collectors prize. Flip it over, read the reference between the lugs, and leave it exactly as it is. The next one is even plainer, and people write it off, precisely because it's small and simple. The second is the Rolex Oyster Date Precision, reference 6694. This is a manual wind watch, no automatic rotor, which makes the case incredibly slim, and at 34mm, it wears elegantly and quietly. While the broader market obsesses over automatic perpetual movements, the hand-wound 6694 gets overlooked, and that's the opportunity, because a clean, original example often sits well below the entry price of a standard vintage Datejust, while delivering the same crown on the dial and the same tactile joy of winding a historic Rolex caliber every morning. People see manual wind and assume it's a lesser or broken watch. The collector sees an honest, slim, affordable entry into vintage Rolex with real upside. The seller prices it like a generic old watch. The buyer reads the 6694 reference, knows it's a clean precision, and pays without negotiating, because they're getting a genuine vintage Rolex for the price of a nice modern fashion watch. If that surprised you, The next is where the dress watch money gets serious. The third is the vintage and mid-size date-just, references like the 1550 and the smaller 6827 and the lady date-just pieces. And this is the category quietly outperforming the famous sports watches in 2026. Conventional wisdom says steel Submariners and Daytonas drive Rolex appreciation, but the data tells a different story. With smaller case dress watches and vintage date-just references posting double-digit surges, the date-just 31 reference, 6827, leading as a top appreciator with its average value climbing dramatically, and the 1550 date close behind. These are watches the market historically considered slow-moving and low premium, which is exactly why owners undervalue them. The tells are originality, and the dial, original, unpolished cases with prominent lug chamfers, faded ghost bezels where fitted, and the warm, creamy patina, the original tritium develops as it ages from white to cream. Two near-identical date-justs can be worlds apart depending on the dial variant, the case condition, and whether it's been polished to death. The family sees grandma's old dress watch. The buyer sees a reference posting 40 to 68% annual gains and pays the asking price without a flicker. Now the list shifts from dress watches to the overlooked tool watches, where the sleeper money lives, and here, two watches that look almost identical are worlds apart. The fourth is the Rolex Explorer 2, reference 16570, specifically the black dial. Mention the 5-digit Explorer 2, and everyone talks about the white polar dial, which photographs beautifully and gets all the attention, leaving the black dial as one of the best-kept secrets in neo-vintage Rolex. Here's the history that matters. The original Explorer 2, the 1655, came only with a black dial, so the black 1650-70 is its true spiritual successor, and it offers a GMT complication, a rugged fixed 24-hour bezel, and independent hour-hand adjustment, arguably the most capable daily wearer on this list. As prices for vintage Submariners and GMT Masters climb out of reach, an excellent black dial 16570 still offers unmatched utility and upside. The two dials sit side by side at similar prices today, but collectors increasingly understand the black one's connection to the original, and that understanding is the value. The seller sees a black Rolex sports watch. The buyer sees the overlooked variant with the direct lineage to the 1655 and quietly buys it before the market catches up. The fifth lesson is the one that costs people the most without them realizing it, and it's about what comes with the watch. With Rolex, originality is the single greatest value driver, and that extends far beyond the watch itself. The original box, the papers, the warranty card, the booklet, the original bracelet with the correct reference stamped in the clasp, the receipt, and the matching serial numbers between papers and watch. Collectors pay significantly more for a complete, full set, and the gap between a bare watch and a documented one can be enormous. Here's the cruel mechanics. The watch goes in a drawer to be kept. The box gets thrown out during a move because it's just a box. The papers get tossed as old clutter. The original bracelet gets swapped for something comfortable, and the real one disappears into a junk drawer. And years later, the most value-additive things you could have kept are gone, because the people who buy bare watches from people who didn't know to keep the rest are doing just fine with that arrangement. In a market crawling with fakes, refinished dials, and married parts, the box and papers are evidence, proof the watch is what it claims to be, and that proof removes risk for the buyer, which is exactly what they pay extra for. So keep everything: the box, the papers, the warranty card, the original bracelet, the spare links, the receipt, and do not sell a Rolex with its accessories in a bulk lot of old watches and jewelry. Itemize every piece because the value of a whole pile can sit in one watch and one original bracelet nobody bothered to separate. The sixth takes that bulk lot danger to its most expensive extreme, and it's the watch hiding inside the pile that's worth more than the entire pile. The two-tone GMT Master references 1675/3 and 1675/3 is the steel and gold travel watch that the market has long stigmatized precisely because it's two-tone, and that stigma is your opportunity. These carry the so-called nipple dials with gold-rimmed hour markers and transitional movements, and they remain dramatically undervalued relative to their all-steel counterparts, despite being the same iconic GMT Master, the same history, the same caliber lineage. The danger is that a two-tone GMT in worn condition gets dismissed as an old gold watch and swept into an estate clear-out, where a dealer offers a single round number for all the watches in the safe. The GMT gets absorbed into the lot. The family sees a fair-sounding total and takes it, relieved to be done, and the buyer walks out, having paid a fraction of one watch's value for everything. This is where the most people lose the most money, not because the watch was disguised as junk, but because it was disguised inside a fast transaction designed to prevent itemization, and the two-tone stigma does half the disguising for free. Grief and exhaustion are the picker's best friends. So the rule, plainly, never sell watches in a bulk lot. Never accept one price for all of them. Photograph every watch front and back, read every reference, and research each one separately, because the entire value of a collection can sit in one piece you didn't recognize. The seventh is the watch where the value comes not from glamour, but from a specific scientific purpose, and the small details that prove it. The Rolex Milgauss, reference 1019, was Rolex's anti-magnetic watch, built for scientists and engineers working around strong magnetic fields, produced quietly from 1960 to 1988. And it never had the fame of the Submariner, because it was a tool for a niche profession, not a status symbol. That's exactly why it stayed affordable, while collectors chased the obvious names. At 38 millimeters, its proportions feel remarkably contemporary, and the market has shifted toward unusual professional references, with real stories, scientific and engineering tool watches, which is precisely where the 1019 sits. The detail that separates a good one from a grail is the dial, the rare CERN dial variants, made for the famous physics laboratory, command serious premiums, and an untrained eye would never know to look. The marks and the specific dial are not noise, they're the whole story, the way a buyer reads a car title. So the Milgauss quietly rewards the person who knows exactly what they're looking at. And in vintage Rolex, that understated confidence rarely goes unrewarded. The seller sees a plain old Rolex with a slightly odd dial. The buyer checks for the CERN variant and the original unpolished case and pays accordingly. We've covered dress watches, tool watches, the box, the bulk lot, and the scientific sleepers. And the last three pull all of it together into the highest ceilings on the list, where a tiny detail decides everything. The eighth is the dial and the patina, the place where two physically identical references sell for wildly different sums based on something most people would try to fix. Today's collectors are responsive to exactly the things that look like flaws. Faded ghost bezel inserts, where the original black aluminum has turned gray, blue, or brown from years of UV and seawater. The creamy patina of original tritium lume, aging from white to a warm shade. Tropical dials that have shifted color over decades. Here's the irony that runs through the whole hobby. A bezel faded to gray is worth more than a crisp replacement, an aged creamy dial more than a bright relumed one, because the wear is proof of originality and age, and originality is the thing being paid for. People get this backwards and freshen up a watch right before selling, replacing the faded insert, reluming the dial, polishing the case, and in doing so, they erase the premium. So when you research, do not look at the active listings, the watches currently for sale, with hopeful asking prices, because anyone can ask any number, and those are fiction. Look at the sold listings, what watches actually changed hands for, and match the exact reference, dial, bezel, and era. Active listings tell you what sellers wish. Sold listings tell you the truth. The ninth is the neo-vintage sleeper and the market inefficiency play, the references sitting in the strange gap between true vintage and modern that savvy buyers are exploiting right now. The Sea Dweller reference 16600 is the perfect example, essentially a hyper-engineered submariner with extreme diving capability and a clean, Cyclops-free profile, yet it trades at a bizarre discount because the Submariner's fame overshadows Rolex's other dive watches entirely. The whole Sea Dweller line is relatively undervalued for that reason. The same logic runs through the GMT Master 2 reference 16760, the Fat Lady, historically vital as the very first GMT Master 2 with the caliber 30085 that finally let the local hour hand be set independently, with a short 5-year production run and the coveted red and black Coke bezel. These are watches with genuine milestone history, trading below the obvious grails simply because they sit outside the spotlight. The lesson is that fame and value are not the same thing, and the inefficiency between them is exactly where the informed buy. You judge these at the reference level, not the family level, because a Sea Dweller or a GMT tells you almost nothing, while the exact reference tells you everything. The 10th is the Grail, the watch where every principle compounds at once and the ceiling climbs out of sight, the most extreme version of the central truth, that the value was lost the moment it passed from someone who knew to someone who didn't. At the very top sit the references that don't shout their worth. The pre-Daytona chronographs, references like the 6238, 6234, and 6034, the watches that came before the legendary Daytona, with estimated production of only around 2 to 2,500 pieces for the 6238 alone, often mistaken for ordinary old chronographs by people who don't realize they predate the most collectible Rolex of all time. The Sea Dweller 1665, Great White, the last acrylic crystal Sea Dweller, with its 5 distinct dial variations, a watch whose value swings enormously on which dial it wears. The rare oyster quartz pieces and the 34mm Zephyr 1008, with its unusual dial, oddities most owners would never recognize as special. And at the summit, anything with a rare original dial, a documented provenance, an unpolished case, and a complete set, because on a Rolex at this level, a single dial variant or an honest, untouched case can mean the difference between a nice used watch and a small fortune. These turn up in ordinary drawers because their significance is invisible to the untrained eye. A normal person sees an old chronograph and has no idea it's a pre-Daytona. Every lesson converges here. Originality of the dial and case, the box and papers, the exact reference and dial variant, the warning never to polish or refinish, and the venue, because where you sell matters as much as what you sell. A rare vintage Rolex, sold to a pawn shop, or a general jeweler, or a bulk estate buyer, is sold to whoever walks by, while the person who will actually recognize and pay for it is a specialist or an auction house that knows the references cold. So here's the checklist that flips you from the person being collected from to the person who knows. Don't polish it. Don't refinish the dial. Don't replace the faded bezel. Don't swap the crystal. Leave every honest mark and faded patch where it is. Flip it over and read the reference between the lugs and the serial, because the look of the watch is only the beginning and the reference is the truth. Keep everything: the box, the papers, the original bracelet, the receipts. Never sell in a bulk lot. Itemize and research each piece on sold listings, not active ones. And when you've found something real, take it to a specialist, not a passerby. If you recognized even one of these, hit the like button and comment below if you've got an old Rolex you can't identify, especially the small and plain ones, and I'd be happy to take a look. Subscribe if you want the part of the market the resellers already know and won't share. Because the truth under all 10 is simple. These watches were never worthless. They were built to look like the ones people overlook, and the only thing standing between you and what they're really worth is knowing. That's not a coincidence either.